Hello and welcome to our season 4 winter mini series. So, we're going to get some amazing episodes in the lead up to the end of this year. And we've got a massive treat for you today. This is one of our most epic podcasts we recorded. There's a beautiful set of illustrations if you watch the YouTube version. And what is it? It's on an amazing early Anglo-Saxon site in the extreme north of England. And there's a kicker. We think also there's a great army camp there. So the Vikings that were attacking the Strathclyders and the Picts in the mid 870s, we think that they have a camp on the same site as this extremely rare early Anglo-Saxon site that has amazing evidence for weaving, metalworking. Women are doing at that time. It's got everything. We've got all the great experts that have been on the dig with us today. It's a packed show. Lots of people we're talking to, and yeah, look, I think you loved it.
Yeah, it was great. It was an absolutely fantastic podcast. It's a beast of a podcast, really. The amount that's covered in it is crazy, and there's so many great images, as you alluded to, and so many great moments that I think it's one of those ones that I think you must go back and watch it on YouTube. If you're listening on Spotify, if you're listening on an Apple podcast or any podcast provider, check it out on YouTube as well. There's some visual elements to this podcast that you won't want to miss.
Take it away. Right, guys, thank you so much for joining us today. And it's an amazing site, but it's a huge site, or potentially huge site. We can't really reveal precisely where it is, but as far as you can you just tell us a little bit about the approximate location, a little bit about the landscape that it's set in, and just introducing what we're going to talk about later, the fact that this is not just a sort of purely academic project. This is a huge community project as well. So if you just tell me a little bit about, why we're interested in this site.
Okay, so we can't reveal the exact location, Tom, you're right, but we're talking about Northumberland, a very beautiful, dramatic and occasionally challenging environment, and the Coquet Valley, so a bit inland from the coast by a river and near a village called Felton. And it's a really interesting location because Felton, the village, has been the location of a ford or crossing point for as long as records go back. And also, it's very close to a Roman road. And the River Coquet is navigable. So we're talking about a location that is very accessible and a good place for people to gather. It's also on a headland. It's wrapped around by water. The Coquet runs along one side, and there's a burn that runs and wraps around it. And so it's high up with tremendous views, as we can all testify to, both west and east. And you can see all sorts from that location. It is incredibly sandy. And you'll see if you look at any photos of the site that it looks like a beach if you're cleared down to the undisturbed landscape. And that, of course, makes the archaeology quite challenging. And it is, I'll talk perhaps a little bit about the challenges of the archaeology in a little later. But one very important thing about the site is not just the archaeology itself, but who was involved. Now, of course, there's us here, and Jane Kershaw can talk about the funding background to it. But what was really important was that we had a huge amount of local involvement and increasing local interest in what we were doing. On site, all our workers were volunteers. And they were volunteers who'd come from projects that Catherine and I and the colleague of ours who can't be here, Sarah Miles, had worked on along Hadrian's Wall. And they had also come completely new to archaeology from the local villages surrounding. And we had young people who were doing their Duke of Edinburghs and were also homeschooled. And it was just wonderful to see over the 3 seasons, well over 100 people get involved, get excited about smudges, brown smudges in sand, and have their eyes opened to what had been going on in just an ordinary field in Northumberland, their predecessors. So that was a really important part of the work.
Yes, no, and that's really what strikes you about this, and we're going to go into a lot of the Great Army and the early medieval period, all the stuff that I think everybody listening to the podcast knows that I love. But the community element was really striking. There was a sort of community that almost built up of the site as well. That everybody who joined has always sort of continued to be a part of it, and the reason that they're there is, it's because it's such a fantastic site. And I want to move on to sort of Jane Kershaw now to sort of talk about the genesis of this site and a little bit about, the era that we're talking about. We mentioned the Great Army earlier, so maybe just talk about, how this site came to be known, and just a little bit about, these chronological parameters that we're maybe looking at here. So Jane, if you just tell us a little bit about, how this amazing early medieval site was discovered.
Yeah, well, just like it was the community that excavated this site, it was also the community that found it originally, because it was discovered through metal detecting. People have been metal detecting as a kind of small and regular group for years, recording their finds with the Portable Antiquities Scheme, and that enabled us as archaeologists to really spot this site as something special in the broader landscape. And that attracted us to the site in the first place. We are interested in the early medieval period in particular, but this site actually has a very long chronology. The metal detector finds go back to the Roman period. There's evidence for early Anglo-Saxon material, Viking Age material, and going beyond that into the medieval period as well. So it's actually a site that wasn't just in existence in the Anglo-Saxon period, but has a much longer history.
That's interesting there when you talk about these, and what Jane Harrison was saying at the beginning, these sites that are at important points in the landscape, these nodal points where there's crossing of a river, for example. And we'll talk about Torksey later as another site associated with the Great Army that's maybe got a slightly sort of similar topography. But I think to start with now, could we talk a little bit about the historical background? So, the reason that we specifically initially, and it changes when we're there because it's such a fascinating site, why we were interested in this site. And I'm going to talk about the Great Army as much as possible, so this is a good a good chance to start. And yeah, we'll go back to Jane Kershaw on this, and if Catherine and Jane Harrison and Lynn want to talk afterwards about what brought them to the site, and how they were interested in it initially, and some of the things that have fascinated them about this site. But beginning as ever with the Great Army, Jane.
Yeah, one of the aspects of the metal detector assemblage that really stood out was little lumps of lead that we recognized as gaming pieces, which are very common finds on other archaeologically investigated sites that are associated with the overwintering of the Viking Great Army. And we had a cluster of 12 or 13 of these gaming pieces, and we thought, right, this is something, this has a Viking feel to it. So we knew there was evidence of Viking activity, and we also had coinage dated to the mid 9th century that's also very much a feature of Viking Great Army sites, and really helped us to pin this site down to the 9th century as well. The Viking Great Army had been raiding in England. Or the Vikings had been raided in England for a good sort of 100 years or so. And the Viking Great Army come in around 865. They land in East Anglia. It's a step up in terms of the level and organization of the Viking military force. They systematically take over different areas of England. England is a sort of patchwork of 7 main kingdoms in this period. They take over Thetford in East Anglia, they take over York, they move down south, they don't manage to take over Wessex, ruled by Alfred the Great, but they go to London. And it's then when they leave London, they go to Torksey in Lincolnshire. And this is the start of the sites we know about from archaeology. They go to Torksey in 872 to 3. And we have evidence, again, from metal detector assemblages and as well as excavation from Torksey. After that, they go to Repton in Derbyshire. That, again, has seen a different form of investigation. And that's when our site potentially picks up, because the sources say that after Repton, the Great Army divides, with one part led by Guthrum and others going into Cambridgeshire to settle, and another part led by Halfdan going north and making a winter base on the River Tyne. And it's this northern branch of the Viking Great Army that we suspect is present at our site. The sources say that Halfdan made a base on the Tyne. We don't know exactly where, but he used this space to then go and raid further north amongst the Picts, and also to the west amongst the Strathclyde Britons. So this is very much a continuation of the military expansion of the Viking Great Army. And we suspect that our site is connected in some way with this northern expansion, whether it's a full army site for overwintering, whether it's a portion of the army, is it a kind of lookout site, or kind of making a temporary base somewhere in advance of longer term settlements. Or, we're not exactly sure of the nature of it, but it must be associated with this period in the later 870s, led by Halfdan, and that happens before that part of the army then heads back down south to Yorkshire, and we get the famous quote in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle that they proceeded to plough and to support themselves, which is taken to be the start of settlement. So in a way, our site is the kind of last hurrah of Viking military activity.
So. I mean, this is the question then, because we're to talk about the site. Then this could potentially be a vast site, couldn't it? It could be sort of 20, 30, 40, 50 plus hectares. Would that be correct? So we could be the sort of needle in a haystack. We're kind of essentially focused on sort of one field at the moment with this site. Is that correct?
We've been working in mainly one field. To judge from the spread of metal detector finds, the site is at least 15 hectares. And I think it's likely to be much more. I mean, the site is defined by the topographic setting. So we have the kind of north-south and west of the site, but we don't know how far it extends to the east. I think it could be easily as large as 40 or 50 hectares potentially, which is in line with other sites that we know about. Torksey is 55, for instance. We do have to remember that at this point, if this is correct in the Viking Great Army, it's after they leave Repton, then it's divided. So we wouldn't necessarily expect as large a site as at Torksey, which was occupied before the Great Army had divided. And if we look at another site that used to be known as Arstey, and is now known as Aldwark, which is to the northeast of York, that site is slightly smaller than Torksey, around 30 hectares, which could possibly be more in line with our site, but we have a minimum of 15.
And I think that's it. Everything we're going to hear here on in is we're just a tiny part of a sort of massive landscape that's been important. Again, like Torksey's got the Roman road and sort of crossing a river as well. There are certain type sites that the Great Army, not just the Great Army, Romans, sort of sort of non-Roman populations, everybody kind of wants to be at these sort of nodal points at landscape where you can have water transport and you can have sort of road transport as well, or some sort of track. So we were going to talk now more about the archaeology of the site, once we got there, because Jane's explained very well about the Portable Antiquities Scheme and the metal detector risk community that made this site visible to us as archaeologists. But I'm just going to introduce and talk to sort of Catherine, and then we'll talk to Lynn after that. Just, can you just tell us a little bit about, how you heard about the site and in terms of it being a Great Army site and how you got involved? So Catherine, I'll go to you first.
So Jane Kershaw brought Jane Harrison in to run some of the excavations for the project. And I was working with Jane on Hadrian's Wall, so got brought in to help with the digging, because I'm always happy to get into a muddy hole in the ground and do some digging. So I was excited to kind of get involved with more of another community project. So my background is Roman, so I didn't really know anything about the Viking Great Army or the early Anglo-Saxon period, but I've kind of been dragged into that world, but it's been really interesting to kind of learn more and see the archaeology.
And we'll hear more about the specific features that you've been looking at, Catherine. But Lynn is our artifact finds supremo. So Lynn, when you first heard about the site, you were hearing this amazing mix that you get in Great Army camps that, got these Stiker coins and these lead gaming pieces and hacked up bits of jewelry. Is that how you kind of first heard about this? You hear the Janes and Catherine, they're sort of saying there's this amazing site, potentially Great Army, because it's got this sort of telltale mix. So just say, how you first heard about it and what you thought we might be dealing with this site.
Well, I've been working on and off with Jane Harrison since about 2008, which is quite a long time. And she mentioned it. And yes, I heard about the various finds, so very excited about it. We'd previously worked on a Viking site in Orkney. So yes, I was very keen to come. And as Jane Kershaw has mentioned, metal detecting on the site whilst we were there, found more of the gaming pieces and some more coins, Stiker, an Archbishop, Wigmund, which I think was 847. So yes, lots of interesting things, yes.
And I just, again, to indulge myself just for a second, we talk about these gaming pieces. Could you just give a little description when we talk about these lead gaming pieces that are associated with essentially sort of thousands of members of the Great Army kind of bored over winter playing board games? Could you just describe what they look like, how big they are? Just because I think that's kind of key for this Great Army sort of phase of things.
They're like thimbles, but not quite as tall as a thimble. And they have varying numbers of little spikes at the top. So we've had some with 3 spikes, they are tiny spikes, and some with none. So obviously they have different values within the game. And
that's perfect. And there's Snaffertaffel, or one of these Taffel games. Yes. Essentially, it's a sort of hunt the king sort of game. So there would have been thousands of them. They're very low value. So when someone loses a game, Thorfinn sort of flips the game, and they spread everywhere, and nobody bothers looking for them because they're very cheap to make. So that's the sort of artifactual evidence that we have of a Great Army presence of sorts. So I'm gonna turn now to Jane Harrison and Catherine about the sort of features that we think date to that sort of period. So Jane, could you just sort of start on that, please?
Yes, I think it's important at this point just to quickly mention that I said it was a site on sand geology, but it's also a site that's been ploughed for hundreds of years. We did find some evidence of sort of 12th century agricultural activity, pits and fences and things, but then that was all overlain by medieval rig and furrow. So it was ploughed in the medieval period and then ploughed in the other direction in the postmodern and modern periods. So we were quite often faced by archaeology that had been cut off or truncated, as we say, by 2 lots of ploughing, creating 2 separate lots of subsoil. So it was really tricky archaeology, which is why we're so proud of the volunteers, because it is to unpick timber-based archaeology in that kind of circumstance is really impressive. But there were, so what has happened, I think, in a lot of parts of the site is that anything later than the sort of 8th century has actually been ploughed away, especially as we're on a slope. But there are some bits surviving, and Catherine actually dug up both of the things that have been dated, have been given a radiocarbon date range that includes the period when we suspect that either part of or the Viking Great Army was linked to this site. And one was in the first year's trench related to a Midden area, and the other was one of the industrial hearths. So perhaps, Catherine, you can say a little bit more about those.
So in the first year, in my trench, we had like a big spread of material that when we got into it ended up being one large sort of midden pit with a series of like later intercutting pits on top of it. So that's the sort of top intercutting pits is where we've gotten this 9th century date out of. And then in the second year, we had a trench that had about 6 hearths in it, just the very bottoms of them. Not a lot remained of those, but enough to get a date. But it also had a really nice oven base as well. So there were definitely some heating activities going on in that area. They were doing whatever, cooking or metal work or something else along those lines in that area.
There does seem to be a link to metalworking with those two, doesn't there, Catherine? Because the hearth that brought the later date, the Viking Age date, was linked to slag and a hearth bottom very close to it. So these are stone built, these hearths, within the sand, and you can tell that they've been used for heating because they go these wonderful red colours, and you see the sand around gets singed and burnt. And there was a hearth bottom is if you're working in metal, little bits of metal that ping off accumulate in the bottom of the little stone bowl that you've built and create a kind of crust. And you get these turning up on sites that are linked to metalworking. So that was what the hearth, and then the spread that Catherine was talking about. I think again it was related to slag. You know, the sort of detritus of working with metal. So that sort of links those two features. But those are the only so far features that are dated to that period. But as I say, we haven't had radiocarbon dating for this last season, and there was a lot of metalworking linked evidence from our last season.
And yeah, just go back to Jane Kershaw there. So then this then would sound like to you and someone who's studied the other Great Army sites, then this is the sort of activities, these sort of light industrial activities that they're getting up to. Would that be correct?
Yes, exactly. That it's quite dispersed over a wide area. Small group centered around hearths, lots of pits, very similar to the Old Walk sites in Yorkshire that I mentioned earlier. So rather than discernible buildings, which we wouldn't really expect with a temporary campsite anyway, we have these much more kind of ephemeral traces, which do kind of go along with a large army. So that makes sense. I mean, there's always this question: what would we expect to find in the archaeology at a Viking Great Army site? You know, no one has buildings yet from any known campsite. So I think the traces are much more dispersed and linked to the sorts of activities that people would have been having to get on with every day. So metalworking, cooking food, rubbish pits, all those sorts of things.
And that's it. I think you know, people can sort of search on the internet. There's various sort of graphical interpretations of this, but it's like fields of tents, isn't it? It's like windbreaks around hearths. It's stuff. It's. I think people have likened it to a sort of, you know, what's there of Glastonbury, you know, a few months, you know, after the, you know, when you've had tens or hundreds of thousands of people there, sort of, you know, sort of camping and cooking and partying and playing games. Maybe not Hnafartafl quite so much, but. And then I can imagine if sort of 6 months after that, there's probably not a huge amount of evidence. You could probably see if there's been a fire or something like that. But I think that's what the sort of picture people have to get is that at the time, it looks like a huge sort of Glastonbury type event. And then 6 months after they've gone, you might not notice that anyone's been there. But unless you've got very clever archaeologists and volunteers like we have. Now,
it would be a lot of rubbish left over. And I think that's what the metal detector finds are showing, that if you leave somewhere in a hurry, which maybe the Viking Great Army did, then you don't take that much care to take everything with you, or you drop something in a muddy field and you don't see it and you never recover it. So if you look at Glastonbury, it's just fields full of rubbish. So there is some sort of analogy there as well with what might have been left over once the Viking Great Army left.
And I think as Lynn can confirm that because we've sort of kept going with metal detecting over the time that we've been there, and put in quite a number of trenches, we have found quite often that concentrations of objects amongst and included amongst those, the ones that we can link potentially to that period in the Viking Great Army, have got no archaeology underneath them. So that kind of ties in with this idea of in effect spreads of rubbish and objects with very few structures to tie them into the landscape, as it were.
And now you've mentioned structures there, so I can do a sort of terrible gear change and get into structures that we do have and into a period or periods before the Great Army that we've got a lot on. So I'm going to turn to Jane Harrison and just ask us to give a little bit of an introduction, because we go to the site, thinking sort of Great Army, and we know there's earlier periods there as well. But what we discover is really quite incredible. So I don't know if Jane can just begin to sort of talk about this pre-Great Army phase when we've got some amazing structures and amazing finds that predate the Viking Age by sort of a couple of hundred years, and maybe just introduce that in terms of what the political economic situation is, what life is like at the time in that beautiful part of the world, even today.
Okay, so as if the Viking Great Army weren't good enough, what it turns out that we've got in this field is an absolutely fantastic early Anglo-Saxon site. And there are broadly three sort of phases. There's a late 6th into early 7th, and then there's a sort of mid-7th into early 8th, and then there's our Viking Age phase. But predominantly what we're getting, the structures are from that earlier late 6th into early 7th period. Now, what we found were buildings that had been used for craft work and for storage, and outdoor working areas with a focus on textile making and metalworking. A kind of rural estate centre, I suppose, which sounds sort of, well, okay. Well, for the early Anglo-Saxon period in this part of the world, that is really incredibly exciting. The archaeology for this period is generally pretty sparse, particularly structurally, because it's all built of wood. And we do have spectacular high status royal sites in the region. Most people will have heard of Yevering or Ag Gefrin, which is the extraordinary site north of where we are, about 26 miles north of this site, which was excavated by Brian Hope Taylor and includes temples and big wooden halls and an amazing assembly area. So an extraordinary royal site mentioned by Bede. And we've got Bamburgh Castle, which is a coastal, wonderful defended site. And of course, a bit later on, you get ecclesiastical sites, but there was very little else other than that. And there were a few burials, and only slowly now is the rest of early Anglo-Saxon Northumbria beginning to be found. And this site will make an enormous contribution to our understanding of how that society worked. Because, of course, it's a really interesting period politically, socially, culturally, because it's a time when all sorts of new identities and entities are forming. In the post-Roman period, in a way, we're north of the wall on that site, and it's an area within Roman sort of diplomatic and military influence. But it's perhaps a place where when the Roman infrastructure collapses and those poor old soldiers pop off back to their wherever they've come from, apart from the ones who settle, of course, then you've got groups in this area, this Northumberland area, who can begin to restructure power. And what you get are sort of small petty kingdoms beginning to coalesce, and you get the growth of what eventually becomes Northumbria at its peak in the sort of 7th centuries. And during that time, of course, you've also got the incoming influence of Northwestern Europe, of Anglo-Saxons. And that's from about the mid-6th century, and we begin to see Anglo-Saxon burials and Anglo-Saxon objects in the area. And alongside that, they are, of course, pagans, but they're coming into an area where the influences to the north and west are Celtic Christianity. And then during the subsequent periods, once the Anglo-Saxon culture and has taken hold, you're getting their conversion as well. So it's an incredibly incredible period of change and development. And what we're seeing really are the emergence of a culture which is based on competition and on endemic conflict in a way. There are kings who have elites round them, and included in those elites will be warriors, poets, priests, smiths, craftspeople. And these are people who need to live off other groups. And so there will be a farming and agricultural community that has to produce the food, the cloth, the metalwork that supports those elite groups. And it's also a very sort of mobile culture. So there'll be royal centres like Yevering. And there will be other major nodal points, as you've called them, estate centres, where elite groups, including sometimes the king, but also his hench people, will travel around, and they will be making alliances. They will be reinforcing their control over groups. They will be handing out sort of judicial. They'll be doing some sort of lawmaking, law giving, and they'll be taking in taxes, the equivalent to taxes or renders in food and cattle and honey and all sorts of things. So it's within that sort of culture of sort of conspicuous consumption, of patronage. You can see that these estate centres, like the site we were working on, are incredibly important. They're what supports this developing kingship and kingdoms, and as those become more structured and more stratified, then the farming and the support networks below them have to become more specialized. And it's worth saying that in a landscape like Northumberland, people are going to have to keep in touch with one another and exchange things more than in some other areas, because the land is a little bit less giving, and you need to, sheep do very well in one area and cattle in another, but you may need to talk to the people in the Millfield Basin who grow really good crops. So that's the kind of context that our site fits into.
And thank you for that. It's a brilliant summary of where we are. And we'll go back to Jane Harrison and talk to Catherine and Lynn about this next, but I just want to speak to Jane briefly. So yeah, Jane, you go looking for the Great Army. You promise all your funders you're getting lots of Vikings, and then you end up with one of the most spectacular Anglo-Saxon sites that has yet been discovered, particularly even in the north of England. So how was that for you?
Well, you have to let the archaeology speak, don't you, and follow what the archaeology says. It's not my call. And no, we were really delighted to find this early Anglo-Saxon material, because, as Jane was saying, it's so rare, particularly in this part of the country, to have such well-preserved features that we can get so much out of, and we can talk about that in a little bit. But also, as Jane was saying, this is a really turbulent period. There has been this sub-Roman population, this kind of British population, and into this area have come the Anglo-Saxons, the people that Bede calls the Angles. They've brought with them their new religion of paganism. There's a new material culture in the buildings and the jewelry and pottery, which is what we've excavated at our site. And they also have a new religion, a new language. which you can tell from the place names in the area that are kind of Germanic and Anglo-Saxon rather than British, all apart from the river names, that is. So that's a huge change that certainly the people living and working at our site would have experienced firsthand. Their parents would have been part of that change as well. They're right in the middle of it. And then there's further change to come as that population becomes Christianized, and you start to get what people call the golden age of Northumbria, which is this sort of cultural flowering associated with Christianity in the later 7th and into the 8th century, which is when you get the famous monastic sites like Monk Wearmouth, Jarrow, and writers such as Bede. You get Cuthbert, you get the Lindisfarne Gospels. You get this incredible output, and our site dates to both of these periods. So it's wonderful to get an archaeology that underlies that this really interesting period of history, and that actually gives us a different viewpoint on it, because it's not a monastic settlement, it's not an elite settlement like Yevering. It's where it's much more typical of the normal population and of day-to-day living and work. This is a site where people worked really hard, and where women worked really hard at weaving.
And that's a brilliant answer, and the best answers are the ones that lead us on to the next question. And so I'm going to ask sort of Jane and other Jane Harrison and Catherine and Lynn now, that what are then these features and these finds that we are getting from this period that Jane Kershaw just perfectly described there. So Jane, could you introduce what the sunken feature buildings, for example? What's a sunken feature building?
Okay, well, we had now 3 sunken feature buildings on the site, and these were buildings that used to be called Grubenhaus, and were, when they were initially found, thought to be the places where the sort of peasants lived, because when you find them, what they look like are huge pits when you first uncover them, and then when you dig into them, you find that they have vertical sides and flat bottoms, and what they are buildings where height is created by digging down. There's a lot of discussion about the forms of sunken feature buildings. There's an idea that a lot of them had sprung wooden floors, so you dug down and created a kind of storage space up to perhaps 1 meter deep, where you could put your beer or store whatever your loom weights perhaps, but anyway, you could store things in with a sprung floor above, and then a kind of tent-like arrangement with 2 big end posts and a roof sort of sloping down from a ridgepole down to the ground. But there are many sorts of sunken feature buildings, and Catherine can talk about the 2 more typical ones we've had on the site. But as is usual in archaeology, we do love to try and kind of put things into categories. But there are all sorts of variants on sunken feature buildings. And the one that we found in 2022 was a bigger one. It's about just over 6 meters by 6 meters. And it is dug down in order to create more height when you put the roof on, but it doesn't have a suspended floor. It has a clay-lined sides in order to hold the sand back, and it has above that wattle and daub, low wattle and daub walls. That's where you weave a framework out of bendy sticks and then put daub, clay mixed with sort of dung and things onto it. And we did find a lot of daub and burnt sticks in the fill, because what happened to these buildings quite often is they burn down and just everything is pushed into the dugout part of it. And this bigger one also had planked ends, and so really was a kind of a combined building between an ordinary sunken feature building and a sort of post-built building. But the exciting thing about it was, and there was a wonderful moment on site, Jane talked about the excitement of finding the preservation. And what usually happens on these kinds of sites is that you you only get the very bottoms of post holes. You don't get any floors, and you find very little. But our finds liaison officer, so he's the person who in Northumberland looks after the finds that metal detectorists declare and puts them up onto the Portable Antiquities Scheme website. So he had come to join us for a day, and there was a sudden intake of breath, a throwing back of the head, and a roar of laughter. And he had just started to uncover a line of loom weights, which were in the base of this large sunken featured building. 26 of them, all in a line, along with another stack of 24 beside them. And we think that these were loom weights that were on the base of an upright loom, and when that building burnt down, had simply dropped off the burnt threads, and then parts of the loom had collapsed around it. We found burnt worked wood as well. There's a possibility that it could have been loom weights stored on a stick, but we think that the other stack of loom weights were actually being stored in a box. And we had a wonderful evening. Of course, this always happens right at the end. And Catherine, perhaps you could describe our last evening on site as we dealt with this extraordinary find.
Yeah, so of course, these loom weights show up in the afternoon on our sort of last full day of digging. And as like such an extraordinary find, we have to really carefully record all of these things. So Jane did some speed drawing to get everything drawn to scales. We had a drawn record of it. We took 1 million photos. And then we stayed on site until it was dark, individually lifting each one of these weights out of the ground, taking photos of them, measuring them, and getting them all bagged and sort of recorded, so that we could kind of replicate this this setup that we had found, and kind of see if we could find differences between the loom weights. And we found that all of the ones that were in a line were of one size, and all the ones that we think were stored in the box were of a slightly different size. So we seem to have 2 sets of loom weights used for sort of slightly different types of textiles, I suppose.
And just to say that those were probably textiles of some heft, because the loom weights are not inconsiderable. They look like a really big donut, and you know, one that you would feel very sick after if you ate the whole of. But alongside, just in the fill of that burnt down building, there were other fragments of loom weights. These loom weights must have broken quite often, because as you worked on the loom, they would gently sort of knock against each other, and they're only baked to a certain temperature, so they would have broken easily. We found lots of fragments of loom weights, and we found lots of fine iron knives, probably used for cutting threads and things like that. And one spectacular find, which perhaps we'll talk about later. Very little in the environmental evidence, although lots of evidence for burnt wood and for daub. Very little crop related evidence from this sunken featured building, and indeed from the other 2, which perhaps, Tom, unless you've got anything else at this point, Catherine could talk about the other 2 sunken featured buildings which she excavated.
Yeah. If we talk about them, and then Lynn can talk about the spectacular find, I can't let that go. And maybe just a bit more about having this huge amount of loom weight to go through as well from a find specialist perspective. But yeah, Catherine, just to start on the other 2 SFBs, as they're known.
Yeah, so after finding the large one in 2022, we were on the lookout this last season to find more of these structures. So we opened up a trench that, when we got into the archaeology, it just looked like it might have been a very large pit. It was just because of the plowing activity had dragged this material sort of in all directions. But once we were down a little bit further, it turned into quite a typical SFB sort of shape. So it's about 2 meters wide by 4 meters long, and about 50 centimeters deep is what was left of the structure. And the fill was all very consistent in this first SFB, but we did get a couple more of the knives. Those seem to be quite a common find across the site. These really fine iron knives, and then we also think, though, that we could tell from the in the section that we left across the center of this SFB, that the entrance was likely on the northeast side of this SFB, which makes sense because the winds, as we all know, having been on site, are coming from the west, and so this is kind of to protect them. You have wind blowing through your little structure every time you open the door. So that was our sort of first one, and then the other SFB that we found, because now that we kind of knew what they looked like, we could look at the geophysical survey that we have of the field, and we could sort of see if we could find that sort of signature in the geophysical survey. And they sort of look like almost like a half moon or crescent moon sort of shape in the geophysical survey. And so we went looking for more of those shapes in the geophys and managed to find another one that we could get a trench over top of. And this one was really interesting because, again, the fill was quite consistent, but when we got down to the bottom, there's this really dark layer of burnt material, and into the natural sand we have a few sort of dark posts, and so it looks like this one would have had a wooden floor that was burnt, and we just have the sort of charcoal remains of that floor.
So I mean, yeah, sorry, I'm just to say it was fascinating to hear about this evolving methodology. But yeah, Jane, yeah, please continue.
Yeah, no, it just to say that the sort of discussion about what these sunken feature buildings were for, and I think it's quite helpful to think of them as you would think of a well-built large shed. Very flexible spaces which you could use for working in, you could use for storage. And if we're thinking about a place where people are coming to collect perhaps their sort of grain renders, or they're collecting them up in order to be sent elsewhere, then to have a flexible storage space as well as possible places that can be used as workshops, then they're a very useful part of this kind of site.
And yeah, no, I think this is a lot of people wouldn't have heard of sunken feature buildings, but I think we're now getting an idea. Just what you said, they are sort of multi-purpose, and they adapt them for the site in terms of their positioning, as Catherine was saying as well. But yeah, no, that's where structures, and we're going to go to Lynn now about the kind of finds, spectacular finds, and also just having to deal with a million loom weights. So could you discuss a little bit about this archaeology from a sort of finds perspective, Lynn?
So quite a wide range of finds, and possibly the most spectacular being a circular copper alloy brooch, which is beautifully decorated. Lots of, as has been pointed out, knives. We've had metal strap ends, lace chaps, belt decorations, metal ones, but also lots of, besides the loom weights, other evidence for textile production. So we start off with spindle wheels where people are spinning wool, ready for the weaving. I am not so interested in the high status finds, if you like. I like everyday finds that tell a story about ordinary people and what they're doing. And so we've also found what we think is a little tablet loom, which would have made a braid, which would be, it could be a belt or a decorated braid, which would decorate the clothes. And for me, possibly one of the most interesting finds was a copper alloy ball with a decorated top. And it just showed that the whole production of textiles potentially on site, from the wool fresh from the sheep to actual clothes people were sewing. This all would not have been suitable for using on leather, but it would be absolutely wonderful to use for sewing together woven fabrics. But yes, lots of other things, lots of pottery. And in the 2021 season, we excavated 2 pits, or a large pit, and about 50% of that year's pottery came from there. And the pottery expert wasn't sure of the date, but we had some radiocarbon. We had an environmental sample for radiocarbon dating, which came back as early 6th century. So the site is producing lots of evidence, not just of high status, but perhaps ordinary things like the pottery. For me, I also get quite excited when the volunteers find things which excite them, because obviously this is their first experience. And in 2023, a chap on his first day excavating found a little Roman bell, which was really lovely for him, and very exciting. So those kinds of things excite me as much as what we actually find, but how they impact on people and how they encourage people to be interested in heritage and continue with the work that we're doing. Yes.
Yeah, that's it. These digs just can't happen without the volunteers.
Yes.
So I think that is a really good point to make that. And two things I'd just like the wider group to discuss is of this that you talked about there, the ceramics. I think that's really, really interesting, and I think we need to describe what they kind of look like, because it's not same anywhere. So, and yeah, that brooch, that disc brooch as well. So I'd like to discuss those two. So I don't know if maybe Jane Harrison wants to start and sort of pass around for comment after that.
Well, perhaps I can start with the pottery, there's a site just north of the village of Felton, so very close to ours, that was excavated relatively recently, that is essentially a 7th century site, where they got a lot of bases of post holes. So they're hypothesizing various post-built buildings, and also what they thought were the bottom of sunken featured buildings. But interestingly, from that site, they found precisely one piece of pottery and one spindle whorl. And we have got actually quite a lot of pottery from this site. And as Lynn emphasised, what's so exciting is that we've got quite a lot of pottery which is now from a radiocarbon dated, secure, so undisturbed contexts in the bottom of deep pits. And that is going to be really important, because we haven't had up until now in this area of the country a securely dated set of fabrics for that period. So that is, for pottery nerds, incredibly exciting. But as you say, it isn't Samian. At first, when people really first start digging and have never dug on this kind of site before, they can miss it. They can miss the pottery, and which is why we say put everything in your tray, and we'll so you get to your eye in. But it's unfired. Unglazed, and has very rough inclusions, so gritty or sandy inclusions, and is in colours from sort of black through to a lovely reddy brown. Handmade, so they're rough, they're chunky, but they're rather beautiful, because the combination of the range of colours and those gritty inclusions makes them, once they're cleaned up and you can look at them closely, really rather attractive. And as I said, we've got a lot from pits and from a building which we haven't spoken about yet, our post-built building. We had a what I think is going to be quite a lot of one pot. So that's exciting. But I think Jane Kershaw perhaps can tell us more about the brooch.
Yes, well, it's a lovely brooch, disc shaped, but not just a typical brooch, because our feeling is that it was originally a mount, possibly a shield mount, that has then been turned into a brooch at a later stage of its life. So it's intricately decorated. The whole surface is covered with contorted animals in a style of the 7th century. But it's the reuse that's quite interesting, and the fact that it was found in our first SFB that we excavated, so that we have this. It would have been worn by a woman. We have extensive evidence for weaving taking place in SFBs at this site. So it's quite nice to have an item of female jewellery where we also have evidence of female work. at a time when women's lives are not particularly well elucidated.
And when we find, I think it was gilt as well. I think if I remember,
it's copper alloy with just a little bit of gilt visible on the surface. But yes, it would have been gilded originally.
And now on a site that's had the Great Army on it, is there ever a second when we think, because we know that the Great Army like nothing better than cutting up gilt copper alloy and sticking it on lead weights that they use in their bullion economy? Was there any sort of thought that you thought, oh, maybe for a second this could be related to something, even though it's 7th, 8th century or whatever, it could actually be later reuse?
I don't think so. I think it's too early, because a lot of the stuff that gets cut up and reused by the Great Army is a bit later. It's more like 8th, early 9th century, whereas here we're in the 7th. And it's not cut; it's complete. You know, the pin is missing, but the item is whole. And so no, I don't think it's related to that. But you're right that cut up pieces of Anglo-Saxon and also Irish metalwork is a key feature of Viking winter camp places, and we do have evidence. One of the things the Vikings did with these cut up pieces is put them in weights to decorate them and to distinguish weights within a set. And we do have evidence for these inset weights at the site, but not with metalwork that's this early in date.
And yeah, that's just a reminder. This site has got so much to give, and it's got so many sort of layers to it. But what I'm going to turn to now is we're talking about quite a lot about the 2021-2022 seasons. We got in the BBC and the BBC Radio and I think sort of Guardian, various sort of international newspapers at the time. But 2023. Or is it 2024? But the 2023 season recently got some publicity for some quite amazing discoveries that we got that are, I never say very unique because something is just unique. But if you can say very unique about anything, it's about this oven. We were talking about loom weights earlier, so we'll start with Jane Harrison, and Catherine and Lynn can come in on the finds that people may have read about already online or in the newspapers.
Yeah, I mean, I think Lynn alluded to the fact that we've got finds for every part of the textile manufacturing process. Because we've got spindle whorls for spinning, as well as the looms and all those loom weights. But what we also found in 2023 was an external oven, which is being used for baking the loom weights. So they'd be formed from clay, and we found a local clay source down in the Burn with a geologist who's working with us, Ian Keel. He found a source for the clay. They're being shaped, but then they're being baked in what is a bit like a pizza oven, I guess. It's a stone base with a fire underneath and a rake out with a sort of, it will have had a top over it, and the weights are being put in and baked. Now, originally, the loom weights were going to be looked at by the amazing Penelope Walton-Rogers, who sadly died at the end of last year after just starting work on our loom weights. And we had a thrilling day talking to her about the site and about the weights. So we're very sad she can't see that work to completion. But she was very insistent that these loom weights are not fired. So they're not fired to high temperatures, so they become very brittle, but they're baked just to firm them up enough to be used in the weaving process. And we have so we've got the oven, and next to it we've got piles of loom weights, and they look when you excavate them like sort of interlocking. They almost look a bit like curved versions of the interlocking beasts on the brooch. They're sort of all wiggled together because the loom weights have begun to slowly disintegrate over the centuries. But there were piles of loom weights next to the oven, and then at the other end we had the offcuts from making them. So if you imagine when you're making biscuits, you have your dough and you stamp a cookie cutter in. And then you've got the bits that you scrunch together and use again, and then eventually it's so nasty you chuck the last bits away. Well, we had sort of offcuts like that at one end, and then in the rest of the trench other little piles of loom weights, and they were the same size and chunkiness as the ones that we found in the sunken and featured building. So this was just thrilling, because I haven't yet found an example, certainly not in this country, of an oven that we know specifically was being used to bake loom weights. And you can imagine, and maybe it was something the children did. They had some way of forming the weights, and they just had to be baked and taken out, and then eventually taken to the places where the weaving was being done. So that was a really exciting find, and it required some very meticulous excavation of all the squiggly wiggly loom weight piles.
Yeah, so I mean it was. I mean, as I say, going back to say, very very unique. But I've literally never seen anything like that. And as Lynn was talking about earlier, it's everything. It's the whole process. So I mean, I would Lynn, just briefly on that. How did the unbaked loom weights, if there are some, I think unbaked ones we're talking about earlier, how do they compare to the sort of baked ones in terms of how you treat them, or how they feel, or you have to conserve them as a fine specialist?
Well, obviously you need to be very careful with both, because clay that's not fired to high temperatures tries to return to its natural form, i.e. clay. So you need to keep them dry. But you need to keep them in the state that they are, so slightly damp, but not allowing them to dry out completely, because they will just crumble away. But you don't want them to get too wet, so it's a careful balance between the two.
I imagine I want to just talk now a little bit about with everyone about going back to the metal finds and metalworking, because I know Catherine did some great work on was it an anvil stone and got hammer scale near it? So we've been talking about this textile side of things, and Lynn saying there made me think about then how does one look after hammer scale, which is tiny little bits of iron that we can talk about in a second. But I'll go to Catherine now maybe and start just talking about again the sort of metalworking side of the site. Maybe just talking about that I may have completely misremembered, but there was an anvil stone of sorts, wasn't there?
I've got it behind
you. Yeah, so in 2021, in the trench with all the intercutting pits, we're getting because we work with metal detectorists while we're on the site as well. So we were getting a really strong metal detecting signal from half of a trench or half of a pit that we hadn't excavated. And so once all the recording was finished, and we had all our photos and everything, before we backfilled, we were able to explore what that was. And that's where we found this stone anvil, sort of a portable anvil is what we think it would have been, with a very large chunk of slag sitting right on top of it. Very handy. And so yes, it's sort of almost cone shaped but this top of this anvil was really smooth and had obviously been had a lot of wear on it. So it was quite well used. But then just across the trench, all the trenches, we're finding mounds and mounds of slag. And we're getting slag from different parts of the metal production process. So we're getting really sort of heavy and sharp sort of slag, but also stuff it looks sort of like almost like pumice. It's full of air, so it's had a lot of air worked into it before it's hardened. And we're also getting vitrified slag because the site is so sandy, and with the temperatures that you're getting when they're doing the metal work, we're getting the slag that's really smooth and shiny. It's got this layer of glass on the outside from the sand that's found on the site. And yeah, I think it's probably our most prolific find is just this slag, and we're getting small pieces, but also really chunky pieces as well.
So we've got metalworking. Then potentially, I'll go to Jane Kershaw on this. We've got probably Anglo-Saxon era or pre-Great Army, and we've got potentially, we think, going on in the Great Army period as well. Is there a way to sort of, without radiocarbon dating, are there any sort of telltale features of either sort of period, Jane Kershaw?
I don't think so, actually. No, I'm not really sure how to answer that question, because I don't think the are any. Jane, do you?
No, I don't think so. I think we have to wait for the radiocarbon dating. I mean, there's certainly, we've got those two dated features that are definitely linked to metalworking, smithing. I think most probably the two that we have already dated to the Great Army period. And last season, the trench that Sarah Miles, who sadly can't be with us today, was working in, was a great sort of expansion of our evidence for metalworking, because there we found what we think was the base of a smelting tower. So again, we're looking at the whole range of a process. So they're getting iron ore from the local hills. There's plenty of local iron ore, and they're smelting it. So to get the workable iron from it in a tower with very high temperatures. So there's a fire at the bottom, and we could see by the colour of the stone base and the sand around how hot it had been. And you'd smelt the iron ore in that, and to get the workable iron out, you actually fracture the tower. And we had remnants of it that had fallen to one side in the ground, and you could see the dynamic falling of the broken tower in the soil, which was fantastic. So they're smelting it, and around that were a lot more of these little bowl hearths where they're working the metal and creating things. Now, with that hasn't yet been dated. There was some pottery which seemed to be our 6th to 7th century pottery associated with some of those hearths, but that's not saying that we may have two phases of metalworking going on the site, some related to that early Anglo-Saxon estate centre and some related to the Viking Great Army. So we'll see. We're awaiting the dating on that.
And just to pull us back, then is so sort of more of an overview of the site and the early Anglo-Saxon estate centre site. Are we seeing zoning then, or are we getting? Yes, yeah. Could you a little bit of just about how that might work?
Okay, so the other structure we haven't talked about yet, that I'm pretty certain, because of the pottery we found with it, belongs to that main late 6th into 7th century phase that links it with the larger sunken feature building, and probably the small ones, and the loom weight making oven, just because it's the same loom weights. We haven't got the dates back for that yet, but it was a big post-built building. So that's a building that is built by putting big posts into the ground at intervals around the outline, and then filling in either with smaller posts or planks, or I think in our case with a wooden base plate between the big posts with planks or wattle and daub above it. And this one, you worked in this, Tom, so you'll remember, as it was about 6 meters wide, and at so far at least 9 long, and probably longer. We think we've got the eastern half of it. And just like with the other parts of the site, the amazing thing about this is that we had surviving floors. And in there was a central stone hearth, which had been used certainly for some cooking. We found spindle wheels around it, so women had been standing around spinning. And because we found a lot of bone that had been broken in certain ways, and in a pile next to the hearth, we did wonder whether one thing they might have been doing was rendering animal fat in order to treat cloths. Because if you treat heavier textiles with animal fat, you're getting something which is really practical and workable. But also, in those surviving floors, not only was there some of our characteristic pottery, but also in an area where the floor was very compacted, we had more of the loom weight. So they may have been doing some weaving there as well. But who knows what's happening at the other end? We haven't yet got definitely places where people are living, although Catherine might want to speak about her trench with the post holes to talk about that. But so we've got this other wonderful building, and there's some hint, Tom, I think, that the area you were working in, that some of the metalworking that was happening in the big metalworking trench from last season is happening a bit later than that post-built building. So that might either be in that 7th to 8th century period, or even in that later Viking Age period.
Fantastic. Yeah, Catherine, if anything, just on, where are people living? If we can think about that.
So the last trench we haven't sort of mentioned yet from this last season, we lovingly named it the sand pit when we were on site, because it was so sandy. Like the wind blew and the sand blew across, and it looked like a beach. The whole thing, it just looked like a beach. And so that took a lot to kind of unpick. And actually, it was kind of good. It was one of the last trenches we went to excavate last year. And actually, because it had settled and the wind had blown a lot of sand around and everything, it became a bit clearer. But essentially, what was in it was about 30 little post holes, I think. I mean, not quite that many, 20 post holes. But this is just the very bottoms of these post holes, maybe 10 to 15 centimeters left. But these sort of surrounded an area that was much more compacted and gravelly compared to the really soft natural sand. And the only reason I really realized this was there is because when we were trying to do the recording, and because it was so sandy, I didn't want to walk through the trench with my boots on, because that would just leave boot prints everywhere. And so I was running around this trench for about 2 days in my socks, so that I wasn't leaving any boot prints throughout. And because of that, I could feel the difference in the texture of the ground. So I could feel this area that was gravelly and a little bit more compact compared to the much more natural sand. So that potentially is an area where we have another structure with this compacted area where they were either living or working. Not really sure. We had no finds come out of that trench. So what we'll be doing now that we're getting to sort of post-excavation is looking at the really clear drawings we have of all of those post holes and the dimensions of them, as well as their location that I took with GPS. And we'll be sort of playing with combinations to see if we can work out if there's sort of groupings of those post holes and what kind of structure might have been in that trench.
Ooh, so watch this space, because the site obviously has everything, but as Catherine was saying there, we're now in the process of trying to get the elements that we haven't seen so far, but we assume are there somewhere, and ascertain then. And we were talking just a moment ago, and as we're just beginning to bring towards an end, I'd like just to mention the cesspits. One always likes to talk about cesspits, but also the Middens and the cesspits, because that's, again, from my almost personal experience, that was the kind of thing that I think about the site. I think of the huge Midden pits and cesspits and the amazing ecofactual finds, the bones. Lynn can maybe talk about them as well. But again, starting with Jane Harrison, could you just tell us a little bit about these amazing pits that really kind of, for me, characterize the site in many ways?
Yes. So we've talked about the structures, we've talked about outdoor ovens and smelting towers, and we also had a number of large pits. And there was one which looked very much in shape like an Iron Age grain pit, if you remember it, Tom, and which was deep with a slightly bell-shaped base, and it was filled up with actually very homogeneous fill, with you had again these knives appear all over the place, and when the environmental sample did produce some evidence for wheat and barley grain in the fills, and that is again dated to that same late 6th into early 7th century period, and whether they were using it like as they did in the Iron Age for storing grain, or whether it was simply a rubbish pit is difficult to know. But they're very deep. I mean, that one was 1 meter plus deep, and there was another one fairly close by, which again was that sort of depth, but would also been backfilled, filled up in a particularly special way. Jane mentioned that the Anglo-Saxon culture, incoming culture, was pagan, and we found at the bottom of that pit a cattle skull, nicely propped up on stones, on burnt stones, in the base of the pit. So some kind of offering closure to the pit, probably related to fertility, either thank you for a good season, or a hope of a better season to come. And then the pit was filled in, and there were arrangements and collections of burnt stone and bone, and some of that bone was the only horse bone that was found on the site.
So that was a really interesting pit, because this what we call special or structured deposition, where in pits and ditches, where people are putting things deliberately into ditches and pits that they're filling up in order to make some kind of offering. And that's a very a pagan Anglo-Saxon characteristic, very characteristic of the Vikings, actually. I mean, I think what's quite fascinating in a way is that the people who came with the Viking Great Army would have related very well to the culture and the economics of our early Anglo-Saxon people. I know that there's a chronological difference, but there are very many sort of similarities between their approaches. So we did have those structured depositions, and then this huge ditch which suggested zoning. We talked about the possibility of zoning, which was well over. It was 1 meter 30 or something. I mean, really deep and very wide and very V-shaped. And luckily, we put the tallest person, not knowing, we put the tallest person on site working on that ditch. It was very good, because he had to literally sort of pull himself out of the, also fortunately fit enough to be able to do that. And that was very interesting, because it'd been filled in, different things had been put into it from different sides, suggesting different things going on either side of the ditch. Now, to one side, there was a lot more evidence for metalworking, and on the other side, there was more evidence for sort of pottery and bone. And it does seem that there is a sort of one area of the site to the northeast that has more buildings, sunken featured buildings, an area which sort of focuses on textiles in the centre and southeast, and then metalworking over to the sort of southwest and west. So there is some sense of zoning going on there. And of course, all that work produces rubbish. And what Catherine can talk about is we had layers of what we call Midden, or rubbish deposition. And that seems to have involved all three phases, which is quite interesting, because we got late 6th to early 7th century radiocarbon dates, and then ones that verged towards the late 7th and early 8th. And then this was the place that we found one of the Viking Age dates. But Catherine can probably talk more about the Midden, and Lynn about the sort of more the range of finds that we got from those places.
Yeah, so that was in the first year that we were digging that we've had this large midden, and with it's a large midden and then later intercutting pits on top of it. But yeah, the midden was just full of bone. There was so much bone that came out of this, and we didn't even get down to the very bottom of this, because it was just too deep to get down to the bottom. But yeah, lots of bone. We had the first knife blade came out of that midden. And yeah, changes in the kind of the texture of the soil that had also filled in, some of it greasier and some of it just sort of more charcoaly. So obviously different episodes of dumping into this pit.
And Lynn, just a little bit more about the finds, the ecofactual or the organic finds that we're getting from these. I'm quite interested in
that pit. The cattle skull was one of the best preserved of the bones. A lot of the bones on the site are not well preserved because it's quite an acidic soil. We do see a lot of large mammal, but whether that's because their survival is better than the small mammal bones, teeth survive an awful lot better. And last year we had what people called tooth henge, because the jaw had completely disintegrated and had left the teeth standing up, which was an interesting find. But you'd actually see some bones and think, oh yes, I'm going to excavate this bone, and no matter how carefully you did it, it would actually fall apart. So the bone is with a bone specialist, or going to a bone specialist. But I think that it's mainly, what I saw was mainly large mammal, probably cattle bone.
Yeah, we've had a report back for the first year, not for the current 22-23 with specialist. 21, it was exactly that, Lynn, wasn't it? It was cattle and then sheep, some pig, and then the horse and the cattle skull from that particular pit, but then also some red deer. So there's hunting going on. And
And can we draw from that maybe feasting again if it's a sort of higher status sort of estate centre?
Well, possibly, because you can imagine the scenario, can't you, where the sort of peripatetic either king or local lord comes round to pick up his collection of grain and cattle and cloth and iron objects and whatever else, and stays and has a feast and eats some of the tribute while he's there, and they've skedaddled off and got hooked a few deer to add into the feast from the woods round about. Yeah.
That's great, because I think it's especially in podcasts like these, it's good to have that view so people can understand how what it might look like, so you can idea that there's feasting going on, but there's still these sort of light industrial activities, and there's maybe hunting going on sort of one day and things like that. So it just gives us that understanding that we as archaeologists, part of our job is to outreach. And as Luke, the producer and co-host, will often say to me, that's what we're here for. And one other thing about outreach is I think we've done our homework. We've discussed holes in the ground, but now I would like to just be very selfish and discuss all the sort of shiny sort of things. I want to start with Jane Kershaw, and I just want you to just it doesn't have to be shiny things, but your kind of favourite finds, or the finds that you think tell us the most about this site. So for me, I quite like I think we had the clay with the possible textile imprint. I think that's a moment in time for me that I quite like, but the disc brooch is up there as well, the gaming pieces. But I'll go to start with Jane Kershaw, and then Jane Harrison and Catherine and Lynn can maybe just sort of bring us to the sort of end and just talk about sort of the sort of artifacts, which I'm very selfishly kind of like to talk about.
Yeah, well, how about I don't choose the Viking artifacts, and I think it has to be the loom weights, and I think it's not just the loom weights themselves, but because they were found within, we could really put them in context thanks to the very meticulous excavation. And I have to say, not all archaeologists would have been able to spot that this was an SFB to excavate it as sort of thoroughly and meticulously as Jane did. And so I think thanks to her expertise, we really have been able to put these loom weights in a context, and we can see that some of them have just dropped from the loom, others are in a box, and the weights are different. We might be able to see some lines of the threads that have kind of dug into the material, so we can kind of see the traces of the thread. And that's important because it tells us about the different types of cloth being worked. So we get so much insight from this survival. We can see there might have been a box of loom weights up on a wall that's fallen down. Both were affected by a fire that came in from one side of the building. So we've just got a little workspace that we can see. We can imagine a woman working there, a woman who would have known about Yevering, who might know people working at Yevering, who might have known people at Bamborough, who had a lot of work to do. So I love the loom weights for what they reveal about women's lives.
Yeah, no, it's very easy almost to overlook because we've talked about them so much, but I think that's a really nice way of actually contextualizing it and talking about the women that are often unseen unless they're sort of the sort of queenly level of society. Thank you very much, Jane Kershaw. Jane Harrison, now, what's your kind of takeaway kind of artifact, as it were?
Okay, well, I think one that I particularly liked was in the postdoc building. One of the volunteers found not the Roman bell that was found early on, but a big bell that would have hung around the neck of a sheep, probably. And I liked that because, as you've hinted at, what's so exciting about this site is you really can imagine it. You really can sort of begin to build it in your mind. And the volunteers were doing that all the time, because they talked about it and they were trying to figure out a sort of picture of what was going on. And you could imagine, in the sand pit, you could imagine perhaps fairly temporary structures where the incoming push people would stay while they were picking up their tributes and having their feasts. And then the sunken featured building where Jane's woman was working her socks off, and the big post-built building where they were weaving but also spinning and perhaps rendering fat, and it was hot and smoky, and the wool that had come in for the spinning caught up in it. So from the fields, out, and it draws the landscape into our site, was a little bell from around a sheep's neck, and it's that linking of our busy site with the local landscape that I really liked about that.
Great, fantastic answer again, Catherine. Now, what would your sort of star item be?
I think it might be sort of more of just a collection of things, but it's the things that the volunteers get really attached to. So like in the first SFB that we excavated last year, one of the smaller ones, in one of the sections, there was this piece of iron sticking out of the section that we had to leave until we had all of our photos taken. So it's just this sort of probably about this much bit of iron to get. And the stories that developed over the month of what this little bit of iron was, it was a Viking sword, it was a dagger that stabbed someone, and all these things. So stuff like that, where the volunteers just really grasp onto it and kind of build these narratives. And in the end, when we finally took it out, it was probably just a nail or a bit of bolt or something. So nothing particularly exciting, but it's just that the idea that they get so engaged and really start trying to sort of fill in the gaps of what we know about what's going on with the site and develop their own stories. And some of those ideas can be really helpful to us. They think about things completely differently than we might approach something. And in that case, didn't quite work out, but it's still always nice to see them trying to sort of build these stories themselves.
All right, that's great. And again, we can't talk about our colleagues and volunteers too much in that. So thanks for that. And Lynn, now you've seen every single artifact. So you're best placed to pick the best one. So I will leave it to you to end the podcast.
I mentioned the all because it was the end of the textile production, potentially, where clothes were made from the woven fabric. But the other thing that springs to mind is one of the metal detected finds, which was a hook, which is the head and neck of a wild bird, like a goose or a duck or a swan, I'm not sure which. It's only a small item, but it was just so beautifully crafted. It's just, to me, a complete work of art. And that would be my second favourite, yes.
And that's I think you can see that range, that eclectic range that we've all talked about, the different aspects, is that kind of gives you an impression of the site. It's multi-period, it's vast. Even though we're in a tiny part, you get this feeling that it's a vast site, and there's money, there's influence, all genders, are represented. It's everyone, all human life is there. And from my perspective, obviously the correct answer was the Viking gaming pieces, but that's the host likes to that. But no, I jest it. I think that's interesting that we started this podcast talking about gaming pieces and the Viking Great Army, and we've ended on them purely because I just mentioned them. But I think we've all discovered that this near Felton, I think we're calling it, as a site is remarkable, not just within the region, but within Britain, northwestern Europe, and there's so much more to come. So hopefully there is more to come. I know we're in the sort of phase of we're not excavating this year, and we've got a huge amount of post-ex work. Can maybe you guys, Jane Harrison will ask first, and then we'll speak to Jane Kershaw after that, and then Catherine and Lynn. What's to be done? What's coming next? So Jane Harrison.
Okay. Well, I think first of all, I'd just like to say a huge thank you, because it was a wonderful site to work on, not just because of the archaeology, but because of the team. It was thoroughly enjoyable. Everyone worked so hard and was such fun to be with, and the volunteers were just fantastic. And over the 3 years, gradually we got more and more embedded in the local community. And the villagers in surrounding villages, and in particular Felton, got very excited about the site. They'd come in and visit, they'd walk their dogs by the site and pop in, and we did talks in the village hall. And I think what we would really like to do as a next phase, because I think there is more for the site to give, there's also more for the wider landscape to give, is to get funding that makes it a totally community focused based project, that might do things like work with test pits in the village to look at the origins of the village and whether we've got some other sort of settlement of the period there in that sort of area, and that might link up with the site to the north. So I think what we'd really like to do is to build on that wonderful community link and to move on with something that widened out, but also drew the community in even tighter.
Yeah, so a legacy. Yeah, so that's really great to hear, and it's very exciting, and hopefully I'd be able to pop down for that again in the future. But Jane Kershaw, now, from your perspective, what are the outcomes that we're still awaiting or working on at the moment?
Well, as you said, we're well into the post-excavation work, and it's always the element of archaeological digs that get kind of forgotten about, so there's never enough funding to do it properly. So we really wanted to make sure that we could give the time, and there was enough funding for these artifacts to be considered by experts and really thoroughly, because they are so rare. So just to have pottery from radiocarbon dated context for this period is really important. So the pottery is going to be considered the animal bone, the environmental, we're going to get more radiocarbon dates from that. The loom weights need to be looked at. The materials need to be analysed. The slag is going to go off. So all of that sort of expert work is being done now, and it's really striking how much you learn from insights like that. So it's a really important part of the picture.
I'll watch the space. A lot of work still to be done. And Catherine, just your sort of final sort of thoughts.
I'm going to be busy sort of digitizing all of our site drawings. We get the volunteers, doing detailed recording of all the features and everything they find. So that all has to be digitized. Like I mentioned, I'll be playing with some of the GIS and doing some mapping for the site and kind of fitting it into the wider landscape and looking at that. So kind of bringing in that sort of digital side of things is what I'll be working on.
Well, that's something, again, as Jane Kershaw was talking, that people kind of just think, oh, you finish digging and eventually a report appears. But this is all the hard yards that are being done at the moment. And Lynn will know all about that with the so many amazing and sometimes enormous finds, very heavy often. Lynn's poor car suffers a lot carrying half of Northumberland back with her. So Lynn, could you just have your final thoughts on what you're kind of working on?
Well, I finished my aspect. All my recording is complete, and the finds are going off to specialists for their reports and their expertise. As James Harrison said, there is so much that we can find out about the area, and I think for me, I'm looking forward to again working with the community volunteers. Because some of those, because of them developing skills and actually working in their own areas on smaller projects, and perhaps projects that will feed into ours eventually, which would be quite interesting.
And I think I'd just like to thank you all. Thank you for that answer, Lynn. Thank you for all. I mean, interesting. Is I've been absolutely fascinated. Luke usually will often send me saying we need to wrap something up, but I think he's engrossed and he hasn't sent me the hurry up for this as well. Hence why we get a chance just to have these lovely bits at the end where we kind of all sum up kind of what the site and working with all these amazing colleagues and lovely people in the community kind of means to us all. So it just remains for me to say to thank all of you for giving up a couple of hours of your time now, at the very least, from all of us at the Red River Archaeology Group and from Luke and I at the Shindig. Thank you very much. And we can't wait to hear more about this project in the future. Thank you very much.
Well, I think people are probably getting tired over the seasons. We said that's one of our great ones, but either if you're just listening to it, there's so much erudition and passion. The community elements really brought out in it. But those finds are just spectacular. Again, if you're just listening to this, do try and go to the Red River Archaeology Group YouTube channel. There's a tab for all our podcasts, and you'll find this podcast here with amazing images in it. So basically, most stuff that we discuss here, if we're talking about a find, if we're talking about one of these Midden pits, if we're talking about some of the Viking type finds, that's on that podcast. And I've been on that dig, so I'm possibly too close to it. But I think, Luke, as an outsider, I think you were equally impressed.
Yeah, it was amazing. Like, not just the actual archaeology that was found there and stuff, but the community aspect of it is something that really kind of stood out to me, and how engaged our guests here today were with people who had no experience, bringing people in from the community to learn about what happened in their area and their history and stuff. And I think that's what always kind of fascinates me about archaeologists like yourself, is this willingness to involve people who have an interest but may not have had the opportunity to go to college or to study it or to go into the field. Pardon the pun, into the field. But it's just one of those things that always fascinates me, that you're so willing to share your knowledge and patience that people have with people like myself who are learning about it kind of as you go. It's incredible. I think this podcast showcases that really well.
Yeah, I think that's what it does. We love archaeology, but we realize that it's still kind of a niche subject. So you've got to bring the public pay for so many of these things, or they're involved in them as volunteers, that it's a duty. We think of archaeology as a vocation, a real calling, and you've got to have almost this evangelical zeal, because there's only people are interested in so many other, they've got their lives to get on with, but we're saying, this is, as a friend of mine, Dan Snow, would say, history is everything that's ever happened. And, a site like we're talking about today, pretty much everything has happened, and it involves local community. And, by doing this podcast, we can get the story out to you. So hopefully it brings all the good things about archaeology and outreach together.
Yeah, absolutely. And on that note, to bring all these things together, why not give us a like, give us a follow, let people know that this podcast exists. Anything you want to see on the podcast, drop a comment in the YouTube comments below, or you can message us on Twitter, on Facebook, on Instagram, on Blue Sky, on LinkedIn. Anywhere you do social media, we also do social media. So drop us a message, let us know what you think of the podcast and what you'd like to see on it in the future.
And thank you very much for listening. Goodbye from the Shindig.